Welcome everyone. Thank you everyone for joining in and registering and joining in for this workshop, which is the fourth in our WISMA Writing Academic series. For those who are new and this is the first seminar you're attending, my name is Gunjan Solly. I'm a lecturer in geography at the Open University. The series has been organized as a result of the pandemic, but it's part of a larger project that was funded by the British Academy with the aim of doing a writing workshop with African scholars, particularly African scholars, on the topic of international student mobility, or rather intra-African student mobility. And as part of that, one of the things we wanted to do was to make sure that we offered some insights and also some guidance on what are the skills and different ways of writing and publishing into particularly British English language peer-reviewed academic journals. So if you've attended our previous workshops, you know we've been going through components of an academic paper. We've looked at the introduction, the literature review, and the analysis, as well as some of the discussions around theory. We will be doing another seminar which looks at conclusions and some of the peer review processes, but we thought we would take a break from sort of the really heavy workshops and dense workshops and discussions we've been having, and to look at some of the back-end processes of what happens once you actually submit a paper. And for that, we have Phil Emmerson from the Royal Geographical Society, who is the managing editor, in fact, of 4 key journals from the Royal Geographical Society. And he's been kind enough to offer his time and to walk us through what are some of the back-end processes that he and his team manage when you send a submission to one of the journals for the RGS, which is under Wiley, I believe. And with that, I think I will hand over to Phil. But actually, before that, let me just give you a quick overview of what the session will be like. If you've attended the previous sessions, you know we have some Q&A sessions after after we present some of the information. While in the past we've had Parvati and Marcus sharing some of that space, it will be Phil. Phil's got the whole stage to himself today. But as before, it will be broken down. So we will have almost three parts to the presentation, and after every part, we will have the opportunity for Q&A. At which point, do feel free to use the chat functionality or use raise the hand, and I will keep an eye out for that and make sure that everyone gets an opportunity to ask a question and engage in the dialogue that we are hoping to have and that we've done in the past. So we can hopefully continue on with the theme and the styles of the discussion that we've had now, and hopefully in the other seminars in the future as well. Which will continue to build on. So as I said before, it would be great if everyone can make sure that they're muted. And yeah, so over to you, Phil.
Thanks very much, Gunjan, and thanks to everyone for having me. I don't feel like I've given up my time. Actually, I feel like you've all given up your time to engage with me. So it's a real pleasure to be here. So I'll briefly introduce kind of what I was planning to do today and what I was planning to talk about and go through, I guess. Before I do that, it's probably worth, thanks for the introduction there, Gunjan. I thought I would introduce myself a little bit, just explain what it is I do, where I come from, what my background is, partly just to set the scene for what I'm going to talk about, and partly as well to put some limits on the kind of things I might be able to engage with. So, as Gunjan said, I'm the managing editor for the Royal Geographical Society, based in London, for the journals, the scholarly publications, so the journals and also the book series actually that we run from the Royal Geographical Society. We have 4 journals, which are pictured there on the right of the slide. So we have Area, Geo, Geography and Environment, which is an open access journal. We have the Geographical Journal, and we have Transactions of the Institute of British Geographers. Broadly speaking, these are considered to be kind of some of the top journals in the field of geography. Certainly they're widely considered that way. They obviously do have their particular histories and things in terms of British geography, and I think that's something we obviously can't escape. It's something that perhaps is also important when it comes to thinking about submissions and things like that, and some of the kind of broader questions around what we might call international journals, I guess. And I'd like to get into that a little bit more in a moment. So my background, I have a PhD in human geography, but it's in cultural geography. So that's only important because I just want to say that I'm not a migration scholar, and I'm not particularly an expert in Africa either. So there is a kind of limit to the kind of content, what goes into the paper, the kind of theoretical side, in terms of what I will talk about and what I can talk about. I guess I don't want to pretend to be an expert on something that I'm not. Instead, what I'm going to do is talk about what I really do know, which is what happens behind the scenes at in a journal, in an academic journal. So what I do specifically as managing editor is that I run the kind of administrative processes for the journals. I manage the submissions and the processes, but there are teams of academic editors who actually run all the editorial decisions, kind of, alongside me. So I run the administrative side, I run the kind of strategic side, I guess, but I'm not also not a kind of academic editor in the formal sense of the word. So yeah, as I say, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and offer what I call here a behind the scenes look. Basically, I'm going to talk about what happens to your paper once it's been submitted to the journal. And I'm not going to talk so much about what you should put in your paper. There are other sessions in this series for that. I will talk specifically to what I know, which is the RGS journals themselves, so that the journals that I run. There are a lot of similarities between what we do and what every other journal does in the world. There are some differences as well. So I will talk to these. Hopefully that will be useful. You may find, if you talk to other editors or look at other journals, that there are some slight differences. I'm hoping that it will be useful at least to go through this so that you might be able to understand even where things are a little different. So that's kind of one thing that I'd like to do in this session, is share some of those insights. But I guess the other thing I want to do here is to try and start a conversation, or at least try and have a conversation. And it's particularly nice here actually to be engaging with a group interested in African scholarship, and I know there will be a number of African scholars, or a good number of African scholars amongst the audience. So it's nice for me to be able to have a conversation with people outside, I guess, what we'd call the so-called global north, because it's not something I get to do enough of, really. And the reason for this, I mean, it's important, I think, because a lot of journals are run out of particularly the UK and particularly the UK and North America. Basically, that's a lot of the so-called top academic journals are run primarily out of those places, and our journals are no different in that respect. But I guess these journals also talk about being global journals or international journals or diverse journals, or whatever way you might put that. We make a big thing. We seek scholarship from all over the world, and things like that. But actually, when you look at a lot of these journals, and I'll hold our hands up, ours are as guilty of this as any. It doesn't always show. There are certain places that are massively underrepresented in terms of the scholarship that we put out, and in terms of even the reviewers we engage. They are hugely underrepresented, and Africa is one of those. So I think it's great to be able to engage with this group. I'm not a big believer that me sat in London should come here and tell people how to publish or what to do in order to publish. I think it should be a more of a two-way street. There's got to be a reason that scholarship is still underrepresented, and basically I think people sat in London or New York or wherever, giving out guidance of how to publish isn't working very well. So I think a conversation is needed and that's sort of what I want to kind of start today. So that's broadly, I guess, the reason I'm here and who I am. In terms of the actual session, apologies, this is a slightly blurry image. It's an image I've taken from, I made it for a series of blogs that I wrote actually for geographers, early career researcher geographers, which the link is at the bottom there, or the link to the first one. There's 3 of them. But I'm sort of going to use this as my map for the session, I guess. So this is the pathway that a paper will follow as it goes through the system, from the moment it's submitted in the top left-hand corner to the moment that you might get a decision letter in the bottom right. You'll notice there's there's two blocks in green. These are the positions where the editor might make a decision on a paper. So the one in the bottom right would be if you'd gone all the way through the peer review process. The green section in the top right there is what we call a desk reject decision, so a decision before peer review takes place. So I will talk more about this as we go through the session, but this is broadly going to be my kind of map or my outline, and we'll work through different bits, as Gunjan said, in 3 different parts. Part 1, I'm going to talk then about actually some of the technical details of how to submit a paper, and how to go. I'm going to run through the process of actually taking your written paper and putting it into a journal. So I do this partly. Many people, I guess, will know this if you've published before or submitted before, but it is a confusing process for lots of people. So I thought it would be helpful just to start there and kind of work our way through. So, how do you submit a paper? Broadly speaking, you submit a paper usually through an online system. There's the major one that a lot of journals use is called Scholar One manuscripts. There are also other online systems. Elsevier, the publishers have a different system, so you might be guided to a different system if you publish in different journals. But broadly speaking, they look very similar. And they do very similar things. I'm using the Geographical Journal, so one of our journals here, just as a guide. This is the same for all of our journals. You go to the different web page to access it, but I'll use the Geographical Journal all the way through as my example. And in order to submit, so the screenshot on the left is the picture of the journal's web page. There's 2 places you can go to submit a journal article. You can either click on the drop-down link at the top which says contribute, and again that will be very similar no matter which journal you're in, or you can click the submit article icon there in the top right, and that'll take you through to the submission portal. In the drop-down menu as well, you'll also see author guidelines there, which every journal should set out their author guidelines, and these are really important in terms of knowing how the journal would like you to submit your paper. So each journal, ours are all the same, all 4 that I run are the same, but each journal will have slightly different guidelines in terms of things like word length, in terms of how they want you to present your references, in terms of how many figures you're allowed, this, and this. So actually, the first place you should always go when you're thinking of submitting to a journal is to those author guidelines, to have a look, see what you need to do, see what the limits are. See, is your paper going to fit into the right word length? Things like that. Are you allowed as many figures as you want to put in? Things like that. So that's worth highlighting. Just to make sure you look at the author guidelines before you do anything. Once you click the submit article, you'll get to a screen that looks something like the screenshot on the right, which is the submission screen. There's an icon, the second one down there says, start new submission. If you click on that, you'll be able to start submitting your paper to the journal. You then go through a number of screens that will look like this. So you have to put in a lot of different information in order to get your paper into the system. It's worth looking at the type of paper. So most journals will have several different types of paper that you can submit, and it's important that you select the right one. So for, if you've got a research paper, you need to select either regular paper, it might say research paper, rather than commentary. Commentary would be a slightly different kind of paper. And similarly, if there's a themed section option or a special section option, you need to make sure that you really are submitting to a special section. And usually you will do that if you've been invited to submit or if you've already applied to submit. So for most papers, it would be regular paper or research paper, or perhaps review paper if it's a review paper that you're submitting. Title you have to put in, that's fairly obvious, and the same with the abstract. Again, worth checking on word limits. So the journals we run offer up to 300 words. Some it's much shorter, some it's much longer. It is worth knowing that, so that you're not kind of struggling at that point to cut down your abstract or to make it much longer when you're trying to submit your paper. The next option is to put up files. So on the right of the screen here, we have uploading files. Again, important to check what files you need. So for most journals, you'll need your main manuscript, and the journal will either want that perhaps with all the identifying details removed. So you might have to remove your name from it. You might have to remove all the references to yourself from it, and then you might have to move things like acknowledgements and even reference to your university. So it's worth checking the guidelines there. They may also ask for other files, so things like title pages, which might be where all that information goes, all the information about you. And they might also ask for figures. Most journals ask for figures to be uploaded as separate files. So if you've made figures, in your Word document directly, you might need to remake them outside your Word document, save them as a JPEG or a different file in order to put them through. I can see a question in the chat, so I might take that one as it is. Themed section commentary. The question was, can you explain what a commentary and a themed paper are? I can, and I will. For our journals, well, commentary is probably the easiest. So where most people would think of an academic paper as a bit of research, so you might you've done some research, you want to report on findings or something like that, match that up with theory, what we might consider, I guess, a normal academic paper. A commentary would be slightly different in that it's usually much shorter. So they're often kind of 1,000 words, 2,000 words, 3,000 words only. And generally they're asking you not to report on original research, but you might make comments on other bits of research or on something that's ongoing. So it might be that you've read a number of papers in the journal that you disagree with for whatever reason, that one of their assumptions is wrong, or Parvati will probably be able to jump in and give a good example of this in relation to migration scholarship. But it might be that you disagree with the assumption that I haven't got one, but an assumption in terms of what these papers are working with. And so you might write a short response to that in the form of a commentary that simply says, something like, I think you've got this assumption wrong, and here's why. So you wouldn't be reporting on a particular bit of research, but you'd be adding your knowledge, your expertise to the conversation that would be ongoing in the journal. Themed section is, so we call these themed sections, they're often called special issues or special sections. These are usually curated on a particular theme, often by an editor or a guest editor for the journal. So someone might say, I want to do a section in your journal on African migration, migration student mobilities or something like that. And they would gather up a set of papers which would then be submitted to the journal to be contained within this special section or themed section. So there'd then be 5 or 6 papers with a guest editorial to kind of round them up. So that's what a theme section is, I guess, or mostly they're called special sections or special issues. And so you'd only click that if you were actually submitting to one of those that we usually pre-arranged submission. I'm just going to read the other question. These are good to have live questions. When you remove acknowledgements, can you still add them later on? Do you still write acknowledgement and then leave it empty thereafter? Yes, is the answer to all of those various bits. Often you can put your acknowledgements in a separate title page. So you might have a title page that has your name, your funding arrangements. If you have funding for your research, it might include acknowledgements in that as well. You can either, for us, you can either just leave it and we'll add it in later. Once the paper's accepted, we reformat them so that all this information's there. So you could write acknowledgements, so that it goes there, or you could just leave it blank, basically. The only reason we don't include them is because we run a double-blind peer review, which means that you don't know who your peer reviewers are, and your peer reviewers don't know who the author of the paper is. And so if we included acknowledgements, it would give away who the author of the paper is, basically, or it could give that away. So another thing you might want to think about here is keywords. And I think it's true of pretty much everyone that I don't think enough people spend enough time thinking about what keywords they might use. So keywords are 5 or 6 words that accompany a paper that give a kind of sense of what it's about. So, if you're writing a paper on international migration or international student mobility in Africa, your keywords might be Africa, international students, mobility, and some other things that perhaps say about, maybe your methods, if you've used, qualitative methods or interview methods or whatever it is, you might include that. The reason these are important is because they help people find a paper. So once your paper's been accepted, the keywords will be published, and actually they connect with all sorts of search functions. So things like Google Scholar will use keywords to help identify a paper, so that when you search, if you search for a paper on international student mobility, the keywords will help that paper appear in front of you. And the reason I say people don't spend enough time on them is because I think most people forget that you have to add keywords to papers, and then they rush them at the end, and they don't always work very well. So they might, you might separate the word international and mobility, for instance, or international and student, which then wouldn't create the best search function, basically. So it's one of those things. It's worth checking how many you get for a journal, and thinking for a little bit about what your keywords are and about how they might help people find your papers. So that's keywords. The bit on the right, I think, is probably the most important, and it's the one that it's probably the newest feature of journals, actually. So it's one that people aren't often expecting to have to do and don't really know what to do with, which is recommended reviewers. So when you submit your journal article, you can actually, in a lot of journals these days, you can recommend some reviewers for the article. So what this means is that these aren't necessarily the people who are going to get asked to review the article, but they're good suggestions that you might make for people who could be, could hold the right expertise, or perhaps who you want to review the article. Often people want their articles read by particular kinds of scholars, particular group of scholars, and so you can add them in at this point. And I'll talk about this later more, but it's really important, I guess, because often editors will use these. So, if you include them, you may well get them used, and it can mean that you your paper, it can mean your paper goes to an appropriate person, because editors, reviewers are not always available. It's not always obvious who has expertise in what. It's there's a knack to finding reviewers and to getting reviewers. And if you've recommended a good set of reviewers, then it can be really helpful to an editor, and it can ensure that your paper goes to appropriate people who actually have the expertise to review it. I'm going to talk about this more later, I think, but another reason to mention this to this group is that statistically, our editors, or I guess many editors, I would guess this is true, we don't use reviewers from Africa anywhere near as much as we should, and it doesn't reflect as well. It doesn't match, I guess, the number of submissions we get from Africa versus the number of reviewers we invite from African scholars. And I think often that's a very practical thing of, particularly if it's not an area that the editor knows particularly well, they may not know who the appropriate scholars are to go to. And so if you get a chance to recommend people, that can be a really good way of ensuring that your paper goes to someone who actually has expertise in the area that you're writing about, not just, or not only, I guess, scholars who perhaps are based in the UK or in North America or Asia or wherever, but who may not have expertise in Africa specifically. So I will come back to that later, but I think recommended reviewers is actually one of the things that you can really do to help an editor out, and two, to ensure that you get a good set of reviews. I've put 3 in this example. It's 3 minimum, so you can add as many as you want. And actually, editors are often very grateful for a good number of suggestions, because it gives them options to choose from, things like that. So do spend some time adding in people. I've given terrible reasons on this example. Lots of people do write, she's an expert in the field, or he's an expert in the field. You can give more specific reasons than that. So do add in as specific a reason as possible. It might be that they're an expert in the particular area that you're writing about. It might be they're an expert in the particular method you're writing about. It might be that they know the particular body of theory that you're talking about, and you can offer a selection of reviewers for different reasons. I've got here, do all reviewers hold PhDs? That's a question from the chat there. No, is the answer. So not necessarily. It depends, although it does depend on the journal, I imagine. I'm going to hold off on that, because I'm going to talk about peer review and selecting peer reviewers later. So if it's all right, I'll hold that question. I'll remember it, and I'll come back to that in a little while. Okay, and then once you've submitted all the information, you put your files in and things. The final thing you've got to do is review the proofs before you submit. This will sound really nitpicky, but I think it's really important. You get 2 options here. You get to view a PDF proof on our journal, certainly a PDF proof and an HTML proof. I'd say it's really, really important to review both, and there's a simple reason for that. So this is a paper I've invented just for the sake of this. It's nonsense. That's the PDF version. When I convert that to HTML, I find out that actually on the right-hand side there, all the text is wrapped around. It looks slightly different once it's in HTML version. And often what happens is that people submit papers that the HTML version doesn't look quite right. The figure caption goes somewhere else in the paper, or the figure image overlaps with some of the text or something like that. The reason it's important to check both is that because both editors and reviewers can read your paper either as a PDF or as HTML. And I feel like increasingly people are viewing them directly online, so viewing the HTML version directly. And if it's not arranged properly in that version, there's a risk that they may just not be able to read it, not be able to engage with it properly, and therefore it may not get reviewed as favourably. So a really simple thing you can do is just to check that it works in both PDF and HTML version, and if it doesn't work in one of those, to kind of edit your manuscript until it does. There's an option on Word to view HTML style files, so that's the easiest way. If you work on Microsoft Word, you can do it that way. So that'll sound like a very pernickety point, but it's one that I think catches people out sometimes. And then the final thing you do is you press submit, and that's it. Your paper is now in the journal system and ready to be assessed on the other end. So I'm going to kind of bring that's sort of what I wanted to talk about in the first section. So before I open up to some questions, I've just got a kind of summary of some key points here. Read and follow the author guidelines. Really important that they give you all the information you need to be able to submit to the journal. One thing I didn't actually talk about there, but I didn't do, but I'd suggest is write a cover letter. So we can perhaps talk about that in the questions if people have questions about cover letters. But outline why you're submitting your paper to the journal. Use the cover letter well to sell your paper to the journal. Choose reviewers that you suggest very carefully. So think carefully about the reviews you're suggesting. Give good reasons. Give as many as you can. It's always really helpful. Ensure your files are in the correct form. So make sure that your files all are the kind of files that the journal wants. Do they need to be PDFs? Do they need to be Word documents? Do they need to be, do they accept LaTeX if you're working in LaTeX? And then I guess the most important thing is if in doubt, email and ask questions. So I say this as the person who sits at the other end of the email. My email address is journals@rgs.org. So if you have a question, you'll most likely email that email address. It's absolutely fine. It's really encouraged. If you're struggling with submitting something or uploading something, or you're not sure on something, just email and ask. It's way easier to do that and for me to answer it that way than to try and deal with it if it's gone in wrong. So my absolute top tip on this end is do just email and ask. It's people like me. We don't mind getting questions. I quite like getting questions. So do engage in that dialogue if you do have those questions. And I guess speaking of questions, it's time to open up to that question point. Gunjan, do you want to kind of interrupt my speaking flow here? Read some questions out.
Right. No, thanks so much for that, Phil. The first is from actually Inyesh. I'll just read it out loud. The question she's asked is the issue, I think, around the right to suggest reviewers and what concerns there might be around transparency.
Yeah, I'm going to make a couple of assumptions about the question. I'm not 100% sure on the scope of the question, so I'll cover it from two different angles, and hopefully that will sort of hit the bill. In terms of suggesting reviewers, I will show you. I mean, later on in the presentation, I'm going to look at how reviewers are selected. So I'll sort of recover this with a visual image there. Or the whole point, I guess, of asking for suggested reviewers is to help an editor out. So if an editor is not, again, I'll cover this later. I'll probably put this in the wrong place, given this, but editors are not always experts in direct experts in whatever the paper is. Depending on the journal you submit to, they may have more specialist knowledge or not. So all of our journals at the Royal Geographical Society are general geography journals, and they cover the whole spectrum of geography and related disciplines. The journals all have a variety of editors that cover different areas, basically. But we don't have editors that cover absolutely every single area of scholarship. So there are points where your editor may not be a direct expert in whatever it is that you're writing about. And that's okay, but that obviously does make it more difficult to select appropriate reviewers, because editors are bound by who they know, who they've heard of, who they can find online, etc., etc., etc. And we can have the discussion that there's all sorts of long-standing issues around expertise. Again, this comes back to internationalization particularly. There's loads of problems around finding what I'll call international to me, I guess, but non-global North scholars on regular search engines. It's sometimes really difficult, and I won't go into the details. There's lots of reasons we might suspect for that. So having the right to suggest reviewers in that sense is useful in terms of highlighting people who are appropriate reviewers. Editors may use them, they may not use them. I guess the other reason to suggest reviewers is that it's helpful in giving a sense of who you think your paper is audience is. So I think I've watched the YouTube of one of the earlier sessions, so I think audience has been discussed, but essentially each paper has an audience. And so by indicating reviewers, you can indicate what kind of audience you think your paper has, who you think would be reading it. And therefore, even if the editor doesn't use the direct suggestions, it might be useful in helping them to find the appropriate people, even if they're not those people. So that's one way to think about it. I guess the other way we might think about transparency here, and this might be the thrust of the question, is in terms of relationship between reviewers and authors. So, if you were to suggest your PhD supervisor, for instance, or former PhD supervisor or PhD student, or your good friend from another university or whatever, you can do that. It's not great practice. It's probably not ethical. And actually, so there are various rules around, or various ethical rules around reviewing and what counts as a conflict of interest. So even if you were to do that, every time we invite a reviewer to review, we put it on them to, it was ethical issues, yeah. So we put it on reviewers to declare any conflicts of interest. So we'd hope that if you did suggest your PhD students or your PhD supervisor, when we invited them to review, they would then, the ethical guidelines would say they should declare that as a conflict of interest if they do know who the author is. We don't invite reviewers from the same institution as the author. We don't assign editors from the same institution as the author. So there are various ethical guidelines. Ultimately, I'm completely honest, I'm sure a few of these do slip through. We also invite multiple reviewers partly for this reason. So we do get reviews from at least 2, if not 3, sometimes 4, sometimes 5 people. So hopefully, even if one of them is, it's an unethical reviewer, I guess, or not the most appropriate reviewer, the others will help to cancel that out. But when you're suggesting, don't be unethical. It's very simple message. But don't suggest people suggest people that you know of, or that you might have met them. If you've met someone at a conference, had a conversation, that's fine. They're not, as long as they're not directly related to your work, or have contributed to your work, or are just very good friends with you, things like this.
Yeah, and to add to what Phil said, and I speak on this coming in as an associate editor on an open access journal that's run out of the Open University College of Science and Technology. The thing with reviewers is that, as Phil said, the body of work is so large that you don't know everyone in the field. You can't know everyone in the field. If you know everyone in the field, then clearly you are either really well networked with everyone, or your field is relatively small. So the advantage of suggesting some reviewers is also doing some work for us, because otherwise it means we'll have to go in, and what we end up doing is perhaps we can speak about this later some more, is just actually looking through your bibliography and seeing who you've cited, who you're talking to. The audience, Phil mentioned that the audience, and we've talked about this before when you're doing literature review. What's the conversation that you're trying to speak into? With whom are you having these conversations and dialogues? And so thinking more strategically as well, right? Do you want the person who's top in the field, in your field, or who publishes the most in your field, to review your paper? Or do you want someone to, what kind of feedback would you like as well? Is it conceptual? Is it empirical? Is it methodological? So a whole loads of other things that could go into it, which the editor of the journal may not know and may not have the time to think through and read through all your paper entirely. So you're also trying to do, help us along as well. Because I know we've struggled with, because as we're trying to broaden and diversify and making sure we're getting submissions from around the world, I only know a very particular cut into gender science technology work, and I don't know the wider field. So it takes, we have spent an hour just trying to Google and find people to do the reviews, and then you hope that they agree to do the reviews as well. But that's another issue, and then the process of the reviewers. There's been a question sitting in there that I think Phil, you also mentioned,
Yes.
which is the cover letter.
Yes, it's one of those things where you do a presentation, you realise I should have included more information about that. So why don't I cover the cover letter now? It's probably the best thing to do. I don't know why I didn't include it. It's practice what you preach. One thing I'm actually going to connect these two things up. So the other thing you can do in terms of suggesting reviewers is you can suggest reviewers that you wouldn't like to be invited. So there's a whole load of reasons you might do this. They may be because they're colleagues. Part of that thing of being ethical is, you think the editor's obviously going to invite this person if they don't know my work, but actually, we're very good colleagues, and there's no point in them inviting that person. So that might be one reason, or they were my PhD supervisors, so don't invite them. The other reason might be, more, I guess, more personal or more scholarly, in the sense that there are people who disagree with your work and with bodies of work, and it doesn't make bodies of work bad. It doesn't make the one person right or the other person, wrong. They just disagree, and often this can be a very frustrating process, because if they're in closely aligned fields and they fundamentally disagree with the premise of your work, they're never going to give it a favourable review, and they might get invited to review a lot. So you may know these people from conferences, you may know them from just being at events in the field, or you may know them from previous rounds of peer review or whatever else. It's okay to say, actually, could you not ask this person for this reason, because they just don't get my method, they don't like my work, whatever it is. It's okay to say that. And one place you might put that is actually in the cover letter, which is how this all ties together. So cover letter is an optional part of submitting to a journal, usually. It comes from the very olden times when you used to send manuscripts by post, so you'd often put an actual physical letter, just saying, dear editors, here's my manuscript, etc. So that's where it comes from. It still exists in the systems of most journals, I think, and it can be used quite productively. So it's basically a good opportunity to sell your paper to the editor. So if you're given the option, I would always say, despite not having done it on my example, I would always say, write a cover letter. And what I would do in that cover letter is I would outline three things. I would outline what your paper is about, the simple things of, this is my paper titled this, it's about this. I would outline how it advances the field, why it's important, those kinds of questions. So, I believe you should publish this paper because it does this, it tells you this, it gives new perspectives on this, that kind of thing. So a good chance to sell your paper to the editor in a more emotive. You can be more emotive than an abstract. I guess you can try and, you can persuade the editor in that way. And then the third thing I would include is, I'll add these to the slides so they can be circulated, is why you've submitted to that journal. So I've chosen to submit to the Geographical Journal because, and it might be because I saw your recent editorial that said you're interested in work on this theme. It might be that you've published these two other papers and I want to contribute to that dialogue. It might be, there's a million reasons you might submit to a journal, but give a reason that is specific to that journal. Because it can be, and some of them, I see it all the time, is that people do write cover letters, but they've obviously submitted to a lot of different journals by the time. And so they've either got a very generic thing that just says, please accept my paper, or sometimes they even have, the wrong journal name on, or the wrong, because they've just recycled this. So a well-crafted cover letter that's specific to the journal actually can probably, it translates your paper from a paper that's come into the journal to a paper that has been submitted to the journal, that you want to publish in this journal specifically. Even if it is the 10th time you've submitted it, if you can rewrite that cover letter each time, just to really sell your paper to the editor. Why should they publish it? Tell them. Because it might be that, perhaps there's some issues with the paper that, that means the editor's not particularly engaged with it, or not particularly, excited by it. But a really good cover letter that tells them why, they might spend some more time reading that and looking for that insight, or looking for whatever it is. It's an extra option to sell your paper, and I would say take it. You can also include extra information, such as please don't invite this person, or here are some people that I think would be good reviewers. That's it's okay to do. Okay, so back to my roadmap. I guess we are moving into what I'm going to call the second section. So I'm going to look here. This is a slightly shorter section, slightly less technical section, but look at actually what happens once that paper lands on my desk initially, and then what happens when I put it onto someone else's desk. So it's this sort of top corner of the diagram we're looking at. So once you click that submit button, I get an email, I get an alert that says a paper's been submitted, and then I can go into my section of Scholar One and look at it. And you'll notice it looks slightly different from the format that you were submitting. The editor's side is much more simple. I guess it's much more pared back. It means that all of the information is text-based at this point, basically. So these are just two screenshots of what is the same screen. It's just scrolled down. So you can see all the information that you would have put in there: your funders, your contact details, your recommended reviewers, your keywords, all on the left there. On the right, we have some other information. Is it a special issue? Yes or no? Which one is it? Graphical table of contents, which we can talk about if people are interested, and short sub-abstracts, data availability statement, and a plagiarism check. So these are the kind of things that I will deal with in terms of this. We use Authenticate as our plagiarism checker. We check absolutely every single paper that comes in without fail. We are required to do so by the Committee of Publishing Ethics. So absolutely every paper will get checked for plagiarism. The way this works, if you've never come across these before, is it basically will scan whatever paper's been submitted against a catalogue of all other papers that I think it scans from the internet. So it really does it trawls the internet, and it will highlight overlaps between papers. So if a paper has been submitted with wording that has if there's a paragraph that's the same as is written somewhere else, it will flag that up to me, and I will be able to look at that. Essentially, we make a judgment on that. So some of those will be quotes, for instance. Some of them will be references, are big parts of this. Some of it will just be natural overlap, where you're writing a similar thing to someone else, and there happens to be an overlap. All of that's okay. What we can't accept, and what we actually can't publish, is direct overlap without an attribution. So if you've used a bit of wording from someone else's paper and not cited them, not quoted them, we actually won't be able to publish that. So you may get your paper either rejected or returned to you, depending on the level of overlap. Generally, I will return a paper. I'm quite aware I'm probably kinder than most of those. So rather than rejecting it, I will usually return a paper with a lot of overlap for rewriting. So it amounts to the same thing. You're going to have to rewrite that paper and submit it again, although it won't count as a rejection. There is no hard and fast rule. It's not a case of below 25% is okay, or above 40% is not okay. It's just it's a judgment we make based on all of the overlap that exists. So it might be that it's just a paragraph you need to change. It might be that it's a whole section. It might be that the whole paper needs to be rewritten. But absolutely, every single paper will get checked for plagiarism. I do various other checks. So what I'm going to call here my administrative checks are as such. Basically, I check that the author is a real person. So there have been a number of instances over the last couple of decades where fake papers have been submitted by fake authors to prove a point of various, so I will check that the author is real. Usually we do this by, there is what's called the ORCID or ORCID system, which has, you register for it. So if a person has an ORCID, they're usually a real person, put simply. Often I will know the author is a person. You can tell. If there are any kind of suspicions, I will start Googling just to check that they are a person who exists out there in the world, isn't just a name attached to a paper. There's not much you can do about that. Be a real person. If you're a real person, that will never be a problem. I check the paper's not plagiarized. As I said, I will return papers that do have problems. I will check that the paper fits with the journal style. So what I mean by this is if the word count is 8,000 words, I check that the word count does fit within that. I check that the references are in the right format, check that the figures are in the right format, things like this. I then check that the paper fits within the journal scope, and I only do this very broadly. So as I said at the outset, I'm not an academic editor. It's not my job in this. So I don't make judgments about quality of papers. I don't make judgments actually about whether the paper is appropriate for the journal. All I check is, we run 4 geography journals. I check that the paper is conceivably about geography or conceivably fits within that journal. If it was about theoretical physics, probably not going to publish it. I probably would return that one. So I mean that's the nature of the check I would do on that. And then I will look at all the other information. So I'll read cover letter, check your data availability statements. I'll check any conflicts of interest, things like that. I basically check that the paper is good to go. It's ready to go and be seen by an editor, and it's appropriate for me to send it to the editor. So providing all's okay, I'll say actually, if there are any minor problems here, I usually return papers to authors. As I say, some journals would reject them at this point. So things like being over word length is really important. It's important that you stay within the journal guidelines, because not all journals have the time, not all have a full-time managing editor, to be honest. And so sometimes they don't have time to start returning papers to authors and asking for changes at that point. They will just reject. So again, that comes back to reading the author guidelines and just making sure that your paper is within that. Data statements I will come back to, if that's all right, because that might be a broader question. Providing everything's okay, so I don't need to return it, I will assign that paper to an editor. And as I briefly touched on in the questions there, we have editors that cover a whole range of topics. So generally, I will try and get a paper to the most appropriate editor. So, if it's a paper on mobility or on migration, I will get it to the editor who focuses on those issues, who has that expertise. If we have one, we don't always have an editor who will cover that. And the other thing is, editors, even the editor, if they've already got a full set of papers on topics like that, they may not have the space to do it. So I may not always be able to assign a paper to the most appropriate editor. That doesn't mean it's going to be badly edited. Doesn't mean this. It just means the only reason I mention that is that you should never assume that your paper is going to a particular editor. You should always look at the full editorial teams, editorial boards, and write for all of them. But yeah, broadly speaking, I'll then assign a paper to an editor. Usually the most appropriate, not always. And they will then read the paper. So they get presented with this screen that's on the right here, but actually the first thing they do is they're going to read the paper and make their initial judgments on it. And there's two judgments they can make. They might decide, yeah, this looks like a reasonable paper, a good paper, whatever it is. I'm going to invite some peer reviewers to this. Or they might decide that actually this paper is not for our journal, and so I'm going to reject it at this point. And this is what's known as the desk reject, or the pre-screen reject. And I think broadly speaking, that there's 5 reasons that a paper might be desk rejected. So one is that it doesn't conform with what I'm calling the journal style. So a paper that's too long, a paper that's not referenced properly, a paper that's these kind of things. What I'd call an administrator reject. So for a technical reason, the paper does not fit in the journal. The second is that it doesn't fit within the journal's scope. So I've separated style and scope here. Scope, I would say, is more about the academic interests of the journal. So that scope might be broad, it might be very narrow. But if you're submitting a paper on African student mobility to a journal that focuses on Southeast Asia only, unless there's a good reason for it to be there, that would probably be beyond the journal scope, and they would probably reject that at that point. Third reason is it doesn't match the journal's aims. So to separate style, scope, and aims seems silly, I guess, but I think there's 3 different things really. So our scope is generally geography. That would be our kind of scope for our journals, the whole set of geography. Aims is slightly different in that not each of our journals has a different aim in terms of the kinds of papers it wants to publish. So some of them are very theoretical, some are more empirical, some are, like the Geographical Journal is focused on public issues. That's what I'd call the journal's aims. And if the journal is trying to promote a particular kind of paper, is trying to publish a particular kind of paper, and you submit one that isn't that kind of paper, then it's probably, it might get desk rejected for that reason. It might not, but it might get desk rejected for that reason. 4, it doesn't say anything new. So this might be that you've written a paper, or someone's written a paper that is, technically a very good paper, good research, good set of findings, whatever else, but has been covered several times before in very similar papers. It doesn't really add to the, to the body of knowledge there. So that there isn't really any reason to publish it, so it might get rejected for that reason. And 5, which seems to be very out of favour to say this, but some papers are just rejected because they're poor papers. They don't use appropriate methods, or they've not got enough data involved in them, or they're badly theorised, or they're just wrong. So some papers will just be rejected because they're not very good papers. I think the solution to all this, you can't do much about a poor quality paper other than change the method or whatever's wrong with it. I think the main solution to getting past the desk reject bit, I know there's been a session, I think, on getting past desk rejects before, but make a clear case within the paper and within the cover letter and within the, all over in the abstract as to why your paper should be published. And basically give the editor no reason to desk reject it. So make sure it looks like papers in the journals. Make sure it's got good methods, make sure it fits with the journal's aim and scope. And again, if you're not sure if your paper does do this, does fit with these things, email and ask. It's okay, and it's good to start a dialogue with editors before you submit. So you might have a paper on something, you're not sure whether it's needs reworking before you submit it, or not sure whether it fits at all. Just email the editor and set out or send them the paper in its early draft and see what they think. And many will be able to comment on that and say, actually, yeah, you need to move this around or do that, or you need to cover a bit more of this. Or they'll say, yeah, that's good to go, bring it in. Or no, I don't, that's not going to work for us. Why don't you send it here? So do make contact before you submit. Don't just guess. If you're not sure, do make contact and find out. I think that's the end of my session too. Yeah, so there's probably space for some questions here.
So there's a question about the data statement, or did you want to do that later? But
no, I can.
Yeah, sorry, go on.
I can do that now, and I'll do it very quickly because it's the question is a data statement mandatory or only if you worked with others? A data statement, actually, it depends on the journal. It's nothing to do with the kind of research you did. So some journals do require a mandatory data statement. We do in our journals. Some don't. So you just need to check. All the data statement, I'll make clear that the data statement for us is about whether your data is publicly available or not. And we have a mandatory statement, but we don't mandate that your data needs to be available. So if it's not available, you can say data is not available. Or if it is available, you can say it's available here, and this is how you access it. So that's all the data statement is.
And I think part of that is also because of the requirement from the UKRI funding agencies that have data management, data requirements as well, that, if it's a funded project, then it has to be, that data has to be made publicly available, anonymized, and all, following all the data protocols, but there's something on that as well. And partly because they also provide funding for, let's say, open access publications. So there's a whole sort of framework within which that data statement is relevant for very particularly UKRI and funding reasons as well.
There's an international landscape to this, though, the publishing landscape, which is there's. I don't want to get into this too much because it's technical and not very interesting, actually. But there is a kind of broader push towards open science in general that extends beyond the UKRI thing. So that from the publisher's side, it's the data statement is about feeding into that move towards what they're calling open science. There's huge questions about whether that works for social science, and it's probably a whole series of workshops in itself. So I don't really want to get into it, but it's actually, I don't think it's as UK led as that. I mean, I think it's just a broader international move. It's as much driven from the US and from Scandinavia as it is from UKRI's move.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. So the next set of questions is around what's understood as poor quality. So I guess if the role of the English language, if English is the first language, the qualities. Sorry if I'm misinterpreting the question.
Do you find poor quality includes use of English language, since some scholars might argue English is the first language? Really good question, and this is one that, when I said I want to have a conversation, this is partly these kinds of things, I guess, that I want to talk about. I personally, it's a difficult question. Depends on the editor is the main thing to say, actually, and depends on the journal. I am very much an advocate of not judging a paper by its quality of English, certainly not at the submission level. I think a paper has to be understandable. And as long as it's understandable, I would make no further judgment on it myself if I was an editor, and I'm not an editor, I should say that. So the unfortunate answer is yes, sometimes that is the case. The answer really should be no, that shouldn't be the case, because it's very expensive to have English language editing, and it's very difficult to if you need that, pay that money without a guarantee that your paper will be published is hugely unfair. And so I think we and all of our journals tend to follow this principle that if it's understandable, we'll go with it. And if we're going to accept it, we might then suggest that before we can accept it, it needs English language editing. But other than that, no, we don't make a judgment on quality based on language. Some journals will, and that's unfortunate and should change. I unfortunately don't have the power to change that. But, so I'm not sure that I don't know whether that helps or not in a sense, but it's yes, sometimes it will matter, sometimes it won't. And when you find those journals where it doesn't matter, write them down, remember them, share them, because they're the ones who are doing it right.
I mean, do you think it's possible, because, one of the things you should suggest is that just email you or the editor and just ask them, is that something that you think someone could ask in one of those emails, or is that a point where by asking it might lead to someone saying, actually, I don't think I want a paper from them. So in fact, having a negative impact on how your paper might get reviewed at the desk.
I don't email me and ask by all means. If you're submitting to one of our journals, do email me and I'll tell you what I just told you. I mean, that's the answer. I don't know. It's hard for me to get into. I can't second guess what someone else might think from receiving an email like that. I'd like to think everyone would say something similar to what I've said, but I'm sure there are people out there who might not be so responsive. I think one of the things on this is, so actually when an editor makes a desk reject decision, part of what they're deciding, I guess, is how much work they're going to have to put into the paper to make it publishable. And that threshold is different for different editors, and it's different for different editors with different papers. So there isn't really a straightforward answer to this, because a really amazing paper with fantastic new findings that says something really innovative and novel and needs to be published will probably get more attention, even if the language isn't so good, than a slightly more, run-of-the-mill paper, a more ordinary paper. Does that make sense?
Sorry, I just wanted to actually say that, yeah, that's really helpful. I think the question is it possible to just say, is my paper understandable, like when you submit it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you certainly could. It's probably a really good idea, actually, is to just send a copy of the paper to whoever the journal contact is, whether it's the editor or the managing editor, and just say, is this level of English okay? And they'll give you a really honest answer. I'd hope, say, yeah, this is fine, or actually, I think you need to get someone with English as their first language or who's fluent in English to look at this. That's probably a really good way around it, actually, which I hadn't thought of, but it's just to say, yeah, just ask them to look, not make a judgment on it, but just, can you read this and just tell me, is the quality of English okay for peer review? Especially if you haven't got the money there and then to pay for English language editing, but if you might have it later, you can say, look, I'll get this done before it's accepted, but I just can't pay that now. I think that would be certainly fine. Or they might say it doesn't need it.
I mean, I might take the privilege of being the chair and ask you a question, Phil, and it's around the structure or the nature of the paper itself. So
yes.
Is there a preference whether it's how theoretically engaging it is versus empirical, or does it always need to be a balance between the theory and empirical, or the conceptual advancements that's making, or could an predominantly empirical only paper fit into, at least, I mean, I recognize you can only speak for the RGS journals, but is there space for just empirical only papers?
I mean, yes, there is. Usually, I mean, it depends what you mean by empirical only, because I'm not sure. It depends. We have to differentiate as well between what I'm going to, with air quotes, called top journals and what I'll, call kind of and there always seem to be top journals and regional journals. I don't really get that, but I think a lot of the RGS we have a broad. We cater to full geographers. Our audience is any geographer. So if you have an empirical case, it will often be quite narrowly defined. And I guess the question that goes beyond that is the sort of, well, why would anyone else care kind of question. So you might have a really nice set of data on a really nice topic that's important in its own right. But if it doesn't have any transferability for our journals, often that can be the kind of sticking point. And that might not be a major problem. That might be something to get written in later, but that may not be a death reject in that sense. But so yes, I mean there is room for empirical only work, although part of you probably shaking your head and saying there's no such thing as empirical only work here, because because it needs to be tied together somehow by some sort of theory or literature. You can't just say, look, I found this thing. But in terms of presenting an empirical case, yes, there's space for that, but we need to know why that matters. So what does it tell us more generally?
But then the problem then becomes that quite often scholarship from the global south is not considered to be applicable to the wider, regardless of whether it's not or not. It assumes that it's not, right? So someone will say the case of London, and somehow that's more applicable globally to Lagos or to Joburg. So how do you then? What ought journals do to be able to, or can journals do anything to overcome this particular bias?
I mean, yeah, I agree. I agree. Why should London be any more applicable than Lagos? And I don't see it as. I wouldn't see it as that's the case. And we scholarship in China. There's so much of it. We publish, more scholarship from China in terms of international than we do Africa. But certainly, Shanghai, Beijing, whereas 20 years ago wouldn't have been seen as applicable cases, are now hugely applicable cases. Lagos, Accra, they're enormously applicable, and they've got a lot to tell us. And we do publish. We publish stuff on. We have a paper going out in the Geographical Journal on Accra's building of sewage systems and stuff, because there's something there to learn. So it's not a case of this place is less relevant than that place. Me writing a paper on London, inner city London's stuff, I don't think that's any more relevant to the world than just because it's London. It's more, I've written my paper on Accra's housing system, and this is important because this, it has an impact on how we understand not necessarily London, but it might be, the rest of the way the continent's developing. It might be that, actually the way that this matches up with or opposes Asian housing development or whatever else it is. It can't just be, this is interesting because I'm saying it's interesting.
Yeah, thanks for that. There's one more question, and I think then we can move on to the next part, and it's around, do you accept qualitative research, quantitative, or mixed methods?
We accept all research and no method sometimes. Some journals, this is worth checking with journals, and it's worth looking. There's probably a broader point here. Apologies, I know I always turn these simple questions into broader points, but if you come across a journal that doesn't publish much qualitative or much quantitative research, and if it doesn't publish much quantitative research and you have quantitative research, that's one I would check with the editor always. Because there might be a reason they don't have much of it in the journal, even if they do accept it. Yes, I would check, even if they say they accept quantitative or qualitative, but there's not much evidence of that. Do check and do think carefully about submitting, because it might be more subtle. It might be the editorial team's not very good at assessing what good, say, qualitative research is, or what good, what good use of GIS is. That may be something that's going on, and it may just not be worth your time submitting. It may be a waste of your time. So we do accept all research, regardless of method. We don't have a stipulation on that. But we don't get as much quantitative stuff as we should. So if you've got quantitative stuff, do send it. I will encourage you to send it, even though it's not as much of it there.
I guess we can move on to the next part then.
Yes. Can I just check the timing?
Yeah.
Have we got time for me to ramble on for a bit longer?
We've got technically 10 minutes, but we usually end up running about 5-10 minutes over anyway. So if people are okay with that, yeah. So.
I will go quickly through this. There's a slightly important bit in this in terms of the reviewer selection. We might have covered it before, so yeah. Sorry, I realise I've talked on for a while. So anyway, the third part of this is it's quite a big box there covering this. Broadly speaking, what I'm going to look at is how a editor selects the reviewers and what they do when the reviews come back. I'm not going to look necessarily at what reviewers do, although I will outline what they're asked to do. So when an editor invites reviewers, they've got two options. We've sort of talked about this before. One is to select the reviewers that you have suggested. So they're shown here in the box at the top of the selection screen. The other is to just invite someone else that they know might work. For our journals, we have what's called a open review system, I guess, or we can invite anyone to review. You don't have to be a member of the journal or a member of, a particular person. If we think you've got the expertise in the right area, we will send a review invite out to you if we want you to review for us. Some journals will select will have a more selective pool, so they might have an editorial board that does all of their reviewing. If you can find that out, it's useful to know sometimes, particularly if it's the second case, because you can then work out exactly who the reviewers are. So you can tailor or perhaps decide whether you are going to submit there, or you can certainly tailor your work a little bit to suit those reviewers if needed. But essentially what the editor does here in the kind of behind the scenes world is they will select some reviewers, they'll invite them, they then have to wait for those reviewers to reply. If someone says no, we can't do this review at this time, then they have to invite more people. So it can take quite a long time to get reviewers to agree. So I guess don't necessarily assume that the review will instantly happen. It does take a little bit of time. If you're uncertain about how much time it is taking, again, kind of the mantra of the session, but do email and ask. I will pick those up. Some journal administrator will pick those up and should let you know. I'm not going to say much more about this because I think I covered it before in terms of how reviewers are selected. This is just what happens when a reviewer agrees. It looks like this. So I'll skip through this. And then I've moved here slightly to, this is what the reviewer sees when they're asked to do their review. And we ask our reviewers to comment on 4 things. So contribution, does the paper make an original important contribution to the field? Research, is the research rigorous and strong? Suitability, does it suit the journal? So what I was talking about in terms of the editors. And style, is it well written and clear with strong arguments? So that's what our reviewers will comment on. That's what they make their comments based on. They will write more or less depending on the reviewer, depending on the paper. You'll see here in the middle of the screen as well, they also get option to write both comments to the author, which you as the author will see. They can also write confidential comments to the editor. So they may be providing some comments to the editor that they don't, that aren't shared directly with you, but which might inform the decision. So it is always worth remembering that editors have that broader set of comments to work from as well. And then they'll be asked to make a recommendation of accept minor revision, major revision, or reject. Once the reviewers come back, so I'm speeding through this a bit to give some time for questions, the editor will then be asked to make a decision. So they might have 2 reviewers, they might have 3 reviewers, they might have 4 reviews. What they need to do is to look at those. They need to summarize them, so that they might emphasize some comments, say actually that's really important, and that's really important that the reviewers have pointed out. They might disregard some others, so they might say, actually, I don't know why this reviewer is mentioning this. That's not important. And they might then add their own judgment, so that they might then add their comments on the paper if they've got a particular view. Particularly if they're an expert in the field, they might have a particular view on the paper. And finally, they've got to make the same decision. So accept, minor revision, major revision, reject, or reject. We offer this reject with referral to our open access journal. What these mean in very quick terms, so accept means good, we'll have this paper as it is. Reject means the same, means the opposite. It means we won't have this. Major revisions mean sort of what that means, but it basically means there are big problems with the paper, but it's not hopeless. So here's the option to review, to revise, significant proportion of it. It might be changing the method slightly. It might be, adding in a whole section or taking a whole section out. And then minor revisions are usually just more, smaller things. So you've got some spelling mistakes. It might be the language at that point. It might be that you need to clarify this, and this. What the reject with the referral means, and you might see some of these as you publish, is that usually that means that the paper's not within scope of the journal that you've submitted it to. But journals have these arrangements where they can then transfer the paper, and sometimes the reviews as well. So if you've had something reviewed, they might transfer the paper and the reviews to a different journal, which can then use those reviews and may accept the paper. People might have questions about that, may have come across those, so I might leave that open to that point. It's not a bad option, that's what I'll say. It can be a really good way to get your paper published more quickly. And then the last slide I've got here is just the what's next. So I'd say if you get to this point where your paper has been peer reviewed, it's always worthwhile. So whatever the outcome, even if it's reject, you get some good comments, hopefully, that will shape the paper and help you work with the paper moving forward. Comments can be difficult to understand. They can be quite hurtful sometimes, not intentionally, but they may feel hurtful. So do take some time to reflect on them. Again, if you're unsure what anything means in the comments, if you're not sure why someone said this or what they're getting at, do email the editor and ask, and they'll probably be able to work with you on that. And then I'd say try and work with the comments you have. So there may be things you disagree with. There may be you may think the reviewer's got it entirely wrong. There may be a whole sort of things, but there's usually a reason why someone's written something in a review, and it's not often because they're stupid or because they haven't got it. And even if they haven't got the point of the paper, you might want to think why that is, I guess, and try and use that to shape the paper further so that those mistakes, those issues don't carry on in the future. Obviously, if you do get some corrections, then you'll have to resubmit those corrections. They may be reviewed again, they may not be reviewed again, and your paper may still be rejected, or it may be accepted, or it may need further revisions. So I'm going to leave that there with 2 minutes plus the extra 5 minutes, if that's all right, to pick up some of the questions.
There's a question in the chat box, Phil, around how to recommend reviewers, especially if actually, Yunting, if you would like to unmute yourself and just ask the question.
Okay, thank you, Phil. That's very helpful. As I described in the chat box, I wonder, because you just mentioned one recommended reviewer, we would like someone who are experts in our research field. But my research is about international student mobility. So some scholars would be do some statistics and do some modeling, but I'm doing qualitative and do case studies. So when I try to recommend it someone, how should I clarify quantitative or qualitative? And yeah, question like this.
I think, sorry, my internet wasn't it crackled a bit, so I may have missed a bit in the middle there. So your research is used. So I'm just trying to catch up. It's
quantitative.
both.
My research is the quantitative and use some case studies. But I got 2 reviewers. I think they are very familiar with the research group. But they ask questions, they go make comments about why you just, for example, why you just select 3 cases, why don't you extend your research group, things like that. But that's against the nature of my research, so I'm very confused about this.
Yeah, I think. Yes, I think in the future you might that might be something to include in a cover letter to say, you know, I think it'd be okay to say I've had this reviewed, and I think it was reviewed by people who are not familiar with qualitative methods. So, you know, can I request that it goes to that? The editor, it depends where the paper's situated, I guess, or what the editor thinks that the paper, what contribution it might be making, because it might be that if it has a more general contribution, it should have a contribution to people even if they don't use qualitative methods, I guess. So it might be in the claims that the paper's making. It might be bad luck that the reviewers just weren't as suitable in the end. It's very difficult for editors to kind of row back once they get some reviews sometimes. So, you know, some do, some don't. If you've got 2 people saying reject, it can be really difficult to then make a decision not to do that, I suppose. So I wouldn't give up. I would always ask for reviewers, and I'd hope editors would always select reviewers that are suited to your methods. But yeah, I think it's, and maybe it's about picking a journal that is just more receptive to those, to that kind of paper. Probably if you're picking a journal that is receptive to that kind of paper, it will get read more as well. So that might be the way forward.
Okay, thank you very much.
No problem.
Thank you for that. Ines, would you like to try again, see if we've got one more question?
Yes, please. Thank you, Dr. Emerson, for your clarification. I wonder, because most of us, English is not our first, need a second language. So I've come across with some journals that recommend particular proofreaders. So I'm asking if yours does it do that?
We do, but we don't mandate that. So I mean, if you go, it works through the publisher Wiley. So if you go on there, they have some proofreading services that they can offer you. We don't. Some journals require a certificate to say something's been proofread in English, or we don't require that. We don't require you to have any particular person proofread your paper. We will read it as it is and make a judgment based on that.
Okay. Thank you.
So you can include those certificates if you want to, but we don't require them.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? I mean, there have been a couple of comments in the chat box on just how helpful this has been. So thank you so much for this, Phil. It's been incredibly helpful for students as well as early career scholars and everyone else who's attended. So
yeah. Just on that note, I have put my email up on the screen. So if anyone does have specific questions or cases or anything they want to talk about, do just drop me an email. I'm happy to answer some email.
I've got one more person, Nisha.
Hi.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for the organization, and thank you, Dr. Emerson, as well. So I'm just curious about the timeline. So because I think students have to sort of have a publication in place before they can graduate. So how long will it take after the reviewer gets their hand on it So they have a month to do their work. And how long after that, with the resubmissions and working with the comments and everything, can a student or can anyone who is submitting get an acceptance?
It's the world's hardest question. It depends. Yes, reviewers do. We give them a month. I think particularly over the last year, we've been very flexible with that month because people have so much going on, both in terms of work and non-work. So we're not being very strict on our month at the moment. We're giving people a bit more space. It also, so reviewers do get a month. It can take 2 or 3 months sometimes to get reviews, and that's particularly this year, just to get people to agree to it because, again, there's just a lot going on at the moment. In terms of practical, I guess the practical question. So I'm going to caveat this whole answer by saying it depends, and don't take me. If I say a number, it will be wrong inevitably because next time you submit, it will take much longer. It can take much longer than this. I would say 3 months, 3 to 4 months for each submission. So for our journal, certainly 3 to 4 months for each submission. So if you submit in January, you may not get your paper back till about now. In fact, this is when our papers from January are about going back. It may then take you a couple of months to revise that paper. So then it might be June, it might be July. And then if you're submitting then, I would expect it not give it another 3 or 4 months. So we're looking at November. It may need another round of revisions then. So I would expect it, for the whole process, give yourself a year. And if it comes in under that, great. That's for our journals. Some journals are quicker. I will say that they give their reviewers much less time. So it depends on your expertise. If you're this is a rule of thumb that isn't always true, but if you're a more qualitative researcher, it's usually slightly quicker. Partly because the papers are usually a little bit shorter. I don't know if that's helpful or just disappointing to people. It's good to be honest, I think.
It's always good to hear somebody who knows the whole thing to let us know these things. It will just calm us down. But I have another question as well. So would you recommend certain time periods for us to send these, or should we submit at any time?
Any time you're ready. We don't have a quiet time or a busy time. So Christmas would be the biggest, over the Christmas period would be the biggest delay in terms of the editors usually decamp for 2 weeks or go on holiday for 2 weeks. So that can be the slowest time if you submit just before Christmas. But I'm talking kind of the week before Christmas. Any other time, just submit, it's fine. We don't have busy and quiet times, it's fairly steady.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
And just to add to that, so it's slightly different, I think, with the open access journals because we are all sort of, there isn't anyone with a paid position, particularly the one that I'm working with. So it really just comes down to us to copy edit, to do all the various bits on our time. So do bear in mind that the people who are reviewing, who are sending out the reviews for certain journals, are doing all of this voluntarily. We're not being paid for our time. So, in fact, before I emailed you, Phil, to organize this session, I had to make sure that my severely overdue review for transactions was sent through. So bearing in mind that the people who are reviewing these are yourselves or others and your peers and your colleagues, and that this is done entirely voluntarily for a lot of us, and there's a lot of labor that's put in. So those timelines get shifted because, as we all know, times and commitments. So
yeah, there may be exactly yourselves. If that makes sense, it may be other people on this call. It's probably worth thinking about it that way. That a student might be trying to squeeze a peer review in alongside trying to get their own paper done because that's what's needed for this whole crazy thing of not just graduating, but then trying to get jobs and things afterwards. So I've had to learn to be very, very patient with people this year, especially the pandemic has forced us to be very patient, and it's very frustrating on all ends. It's a real balancing act in terms of doing right by the authors, doing right by the reviewers, as you say, who are usually working for us for free, doing right by the editors who are stretched themselves. We don't always get it right. And again, if you're worried, I mean, I will sound like a broken record, but if you want to know where your paper's up to, if it's in the system, do just send a nice email. Usually after 3 months, I'd suggest give it 3 months, and then send an email and just inquire. I answer 3 or 4 a day. Just keep asking, where are we up to? How's it going? Can I expect an outcome soon? They're not a problem, and I'm quite happy to answer them.
Thanks so much for that, Phil. Unless there are any other questions, I think that would be a wrap for this session. Thank you so much to everyone. Also, just to say that we will, those who've attended the session for the first time, this is part of a series, so we will have another session next month. We're just trying to flesh out the details of that. So do keep an eye out, follow us on Twitter, or subscribe to our YouTube channel, or just send us an email, whatever works for you. There are multiple ways of contacting. And do take the advantage and the opportunities to email Phil. Ask questions.
I really mean it. Send me emails, because these conversations are really valuable.
Yeah. No, absolutely, and thank you so very much for the discussions, to everyone who's asked the questions, to everyone who's participated, to Phil for taking the time to share all of these details and information, and just showing, sort of making us aware that it's not just a black box, that we don't know what's happening, to just give us some more insight as to what some of these processes are. A rare opportunity. So once again, thank you so very much for this. And we'll be in touch with all the participants with hopefully a follow-on questionnaire and just your feedback on this, and update you on the next month session.